as the Commissioner has said. In my remarks, I wanted to just respond to some of the points and the questions that have been asked, and I apologise if I miss anybody or any point that's been raised. I want to, I suppose, firstly begin by agreeing with the condemnation of the atrocity in the university in Aleppo yesterday, and I think that everybody in this House, I'm sure, shares in that condemnation. And also to agree with Mr Salafranca about the potential catastrophe, loss of life and deepening humanitarian crisis if this conflict continues indefinitely into the future, and that is why we must redouble our efforts. Specifically, in response to your question about the talks in Geneva and the tripartite meeting which took place, the EU was not there. This was the second meeting between Mr Brahimi, the US and Russia, and it was Mr Brahimi's plan to keep that particular forum, that particular dialogue between the three, and we understand that, but we are in constant contact and communication, of course, with him and his team, and we are constantly updated, informed as to the progress that he is making, the discussions and dialogue that he has, and that, of course, is the commitment of the EU to be fully engaged in every possible forum where there is an opportunity to contribute. In answer to Mrs de Keyser, the EU is participating in all efforts relating to accountability, both in Geneva and in New York, and that will continue to be the case. A number of points were raised by Mrs Šáke and, excuse my pronunciations if I get this wrong, but I'll make my best attempt, and Mrs Flotre. We are all aware of the shortcomings of our combined efforts, whether on the diplomatic or the humanitarian front. It's not a perfect process, that's for sure, but the situation, I think, cannot just be simplified, as sometimes it's easy to do. We need to look into all of the possible options, all aspects and all opportunities for cooperation with NGOs, as Commissioner Georgieva has pointed out, and the different civilian organisations, to see how we can help them, how we can best support them, how we can ensure that humanitarian aid meets the target, which is the civilians who are suffering for the variety of reasons which have been set out by members and indeed by the Commissioner, not least the deteriorating weather conditions. And we are acting with each of them in a very concrete way, in a very coordinated way, and we are doing everything that we can to support them on the ground. So that commitment, that determination, and in practice those steps are being taken by the EU and will continue to be. I suppose, just in summary, I would like to just say that the cooperation between the European Parliament and the institutions is extremely important in order to carry forward the daily work, the day-to-day work on the humanitarian front and indeed on the political front. We have to provide every possible opportunity to provide support, to help the opposition and to enable better protection for civilians, and that's, I think, an immediate and very pressing priority. We will be focusing on finding better ways to make our efforts more effective. There will be an opportunity to review all the sanctions and the various steps that have been taken at the next Foreign Affairs Council, and intensive regional cooperation efforts are also underway to ensure that the spillover effects from the Syrian conflict, which of course has been mentioned by a number of members, I won't name everybody, but by a number of members, and we will do everything we can to contain that and to ensure that there isn't further destabilisation of what is, I think we can all acknowledge, an extremely volatile region. Thank you.
Gracias, señora ministra.
Thank you very much, Minister. That brought that debate to a close. The next point in the House's business is a joint debate on the Associate Partnership and Cooperation Agreement between the EU and Iraq. There is a recommendation by Mr. Mauro on the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, and there is a statement by the Vice President. To be delivered by the Minister once again, in absence of Lady Ashton. I'm informed that Mr. Mauro cannot attend this debate and will be replaced in introducing the recommendation by Mr. Salafranca. So, Mr. Salafranca, you now have 4 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Commissioner, Minister, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Mauro has indeed had to leave Strasbourg and has asked me to introduce his report on relations with Iraq, which I'm very happy to do. Before I tell you what Mr. Mauro thinks about this report, I'd like to say, Mr. President, in relation to the previous debate, that I too would have liked the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Lady Ashton, to be here. But I want to remind the House that her absence is due to a commitment, an agreement with political forces in this House. Now, I don't know if it's my job to say that she is no longer in Kosovo, but she's now in Brussels meeting the Malian Foreign Minister and preparing the Extraordinary Foreign Affairs Council, which will be dealing with that subject tomorrow. Now, Mr. President, let me give you the views of the rapporteur, Mr. Mauro. First of all, this agreement represents the first contractual agreement between the European Union and Iraq, not just on the trade side, but on a great many other aspects as well. And his proposal is, what it intends to do is to strengthen relations between the two countries. There is an important chapter about cooperation in health, in education, in the fight against poverty, in encouraging transparency, and in effective governance. As regards commercial aspects, the agreement, which is not a preferential agreement, includes the fundamental WTO principles, although Iraq is not a member of that organization. Certain of its clauses have very strong implications on important policies, like the fight against weapons of mass destruction, the fight against terrorism and drug smuggling, the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, particularly those of ethnic and religious minorities, they being the most exposed to risk in that region. This is a resolution which pays particular attention to human rights and to the involvement of women in the process of reconstruction, of post-conflict reconstruction. It also talks about important levels of political and economic life where women should play a role, and the Iraqi authorities have to take the necessary measures so that a civil society can be developed to play an important part in the political process. Mr. Mauro also calls for measures to encourage independent media of a pluralist and professional kind, and he encourages the idea of the European Union fostering national reconciliation in Iraq on the basis of political dialogue, excluding no group. The Iraqi government should respond to concerns on human rights continuously expressed through the statements of the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights, and the need to fight against impunity and strengthen the courts. Adding a statement on future relations with the Union in this report means that Iraq is at a critical stage. That the American troop withdrawal began a few years ago is now concluded. the country is moving towards a coalition government to take into account the agreement established between different political forces in Iraq. The European Union cannot ignore its responsibilities here. It needs to support the Iraqi authorities in order to contribute to the reconstruction and development of the country, as well as stability, national stability, and to overcome the humanitarian emergency and to protect fundamental rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, it's important for the European Union to bet on the future, strategically on the future of Iraq, and this agreement is a very important signal of that intention. But the road is a long one, and I remain convinced that the European Union will have to live up to its ambitions, and this resolution should clearly serve that end. Thank you, Mr. President.
Señora Creighton.
Now I call Mrs. Creighton to reply on that statement.
Mr. President, honourable members, thank you, Mr. Salafranca, for your intervention, and allow me in his absence to congratulate also the rapporteur, Mr. Mauro, and the European Parliament for this excellent and comprehensive report on the EU-Iraq Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which highlights the main issues and the challenges in the EU's relations with Iraq. While focusing on the agreement, the report also looks into the wider context of the best ways to promote EU interests and the European values in Iraq. The EU has a long-standing commitment to support Iraq in its reconstruction and transition to democracy, with the objective of helping to build a stable, prosperous and democratic Iraq, reintegrated in regional and global structures. The EU has been a major donor to Iraq, providing support in many areas such as basic services, assistance to refugees and displaced persons, as well as the strengthening of the political system, the rule of law and the protection of human rights, for example through the CSTP Rule of Law EU Just Lex mission. EU overall support to Iraq since 2003 has amounted to over €1 billion, and this without counting the bilateral contributions, of course, of Member States. With the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, we have opened a new chapter in our bilateral relationship. This is the first such agreement to frame the relations between the EU and Iraq, providing a clear legal basis and a comprehensive institutional structure. The High Representative and Vice President was very pleased to sign in May last year with Iraqi Foreign Minister Zebari this historic agreement, which is good for Iraq, good for the EU and good for our long-term relationship. And we are now looking forward to working with Iraq on its implementation. That is what the agreement is about, the start of a new partnership, sealing our common wish to work together on a whole range of issues where we both have a lot to gain, but also providing a platform to talk about difficult issues, including the promotion of security, the cooperation in countering terrorism and arms proliferation, and the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The agreement also provides for cooperation in support of Iraq's accession to the International Criminal Court. We are committed to boosting trade and investment between the EU and Iraq. Economics meets politics is a formula which is dear to the High Representative. Increased trade and investment will be crucial to back the work on the political front to support Iraq's transformation into a stable and prosperous democratic nation. The agreement will support Iraq's reform and development efforts and facilitate its integration into the wider international economy. It should also be a stepping stone to Iraq's WTO accession, supporting its adaptation to WTO rules and practice. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement with Iraq is a non-preferential agreement based on most favoured nation principles. It offers very substantial market access to the EU and some preferential elements in public procurement, services and investments. The agreement also provides ample opportunities for enhanced cooperation on sectoral policies across the board, from energy and environment to education and innovation. Let me stress the example of energy, where the EU can help Iraq to harness its enormous energy potential, while Iraq can contribute to the diversification of the EU's energy supply and to its energy security, as it is a potential source country for the Southern Corridor. There was a commitment with Minister Hoshyar Zebari during the signature event in May for the rapid implementation of the main parts of the agreement that are provisionally applicable pending ratification. The EEAS is discussing with Iraqi counterparts the way forward so that progress is made as soon as possible. In this respect, I would also like to emphasise the important role of the European Parliament. The Parliamentary Cooperation Committee should be an important forum for the European and Iraqi parliaments, providing excellent opportunities to exchange on democratic practice and provide further support to Iraq's transition. This partnership is not, of course, without challenges. Iraq is a young democracy and the road ahead will not always be smooth. Iraq has made considerable progress in its transition towards democracy, but continues to face serious political, security and socio-economic challenges. The level of violence in Iraq is still unacceptably high, and recently tensions between the major political forces, Shia, Sunni and Kurdish, are on the rise. This carries a risk of reigniting sectarian tensions in Iraq, and it threatens the fragile balance that the National Partnership Government is based on. It also slows down the necessary reforms as well as socio-economic progress. The human rights situation continues to be of serious concern, with the increased use of the death penalty and unsatisfactory situation for women and vulnerable groups, including minorities. Camp Ashraf remains an important and sensitive issue. There has been some progress, but there are still a number of challenges in the critical process facilitated by the United Nations with our full support. The EU is also committed to supporting the UN process with a contribution of €12 million to support the operations of the UN monitors and the UNHCR refugee status determination process. The High Representative, Vice President and the Member States all follow the recent developments in Iraq with great concern. It's in everybody's interest to see a stable, democratic and prosperous Iraq, where the political system is underpinned by a strengthened rule of law and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement therefore arrives at a very timely moment, since it creates a platform and increases the EU leverage to address these concerns with Iraqi counterparts. We must see Iraq's transition also in the regional context, in particular with respect to the dramatic and violent developments unfolding across the border in Syria, which we've just discussed, but also Iran's increasing influence. This adds to the difficulty of Iraq's democratic endeavours, but makes its success even more important. So let me conclude by stressing that this agreement is above all a symbol of the EU's wish to be a constructive partner for Iraq in its democratic endeavours. It brings together the EU and its member states, and it is the main instrument to show the EU's unified determination to build a long-term partnership with a stable and democratic Iraq, not just for today or tomorrow, but for many years to come. Thank you.
Signora Ministra.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. On behalf of our International Trade Committee, Mrs. Badia is going to complete this part of the speech for 1 minute. Thank you very much indeed, President, Commissioner, Minister. The first thing I would like to do is stress how important this agreement is, because it's the first the EU is going to sign with Iraq. The agreement is going to go alongside the democratic transition of this country, its reconstruction and political normalization within the international community. As a rapporteur of the opinion from the International Trade Committee, I would like to stress the trade trade provisions included, the inclusion of the basic rules from the World Trade Organization, but particularly the important point to be stressed is the technical and logistical support which the Commission and the EU can extend to this country in this moment of transition. I'd also like to point out that this agreement is going to facilitate access for the EU to services markets and public works markets, and it's going to serve the links between the EU and Iraq. So basically it represents trade as an essential resource for increasing stability and prosperity in Iraq, and the agreement we're going to vote on tomorrow is a huge opportunity both for Iraq and for the European Union. Thank you. Thank you. That takes us on to the speakers on behalf of the groups. To begin with, for 3 minutes, Mrs. SAïFI, on behalf of the EPP.
Thank you. Minister, colleagues, first of all, I'd just like to thank Mr. Mario Mauro for the work he's done on this dossier and the presentation that was given. I would also like to say that I think that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement is an important stage in the relations between the European Union and Iraq. It will allow the EU to provide better support to Iraq's transition to democracy and also invest considerably in a sustainable economy and one which will be mutually beneficial as part of the WTO, because Iraq has been asking for membership since 2004. It's also going to encourage the country to make new efforts and to initiate new reforms. Because despite all of the obstacles, Iraq is on the road to democracy. For instance, local elections have been organized this year, and parliamentary elections have been organized for next year. However, there are several topics which continue to cause concern for me. Firstly, the day-to-day life of Iraqis. Physical safety, 23 people killed and many more injured in another attack this morning. Also, the social crisis that started when the Iraqi government decided to end rationing cards. Also, widespread corruption, unemployment and poverty. I would also remind you that in 2012, Iraq received almost $80 billion in oil revenue, and yet about 90% of the population lives below the poverty threshold. This is a situation that can't continue. Human rights issues are also of vital importance for Iraqi authorities. The status of prisoners still hasn't been finalized. Religious minorities, particularly the Christian minority, are increasingly isolated. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights asked in November last year for a moratorium on the death penalty. There's been a huge number of executions this year. As well as providing purely financial support, the EU could bring additional added value and start a new commitment from both parties towards a democratic Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the S&D Group, for 2.5 minutes, Mrs. Koppa. Thank you very much indeed, President. On behalf of my political group, I would like to say that this agreement is crucial between the EU and Iraq. First and foremost, because we are in a position to extend essential aid to this country on the long path towards normality and stabilization, and also because terrorism and violence can only be addressed by support from the international community. Through our agreement, we're in a position to particularly stress the issue of human rights and fundamental individual freedoms. It's very important that this agreement has a specific clause on the access of Iraq to the ICC. It's also clear that if Iraq does not manage to make progress on this very sensitive issue, then all of the development and cooperation programs will be affected. But the basic challenge is still for Iraq to retain national unity and sort out its problems internally. That's the only way it will be able to make headway, establishing stability within viable development. Access to basic services is essential, and that's why our support also has to focus on actions which will aim at improving the conditions of existence for the Iraqi population, and that will be even more effective if there is cooperation with the United Nations. An open dialogue, political dialogue for all communities, I think will help them to work together and help them to come up with a joint solution to the major question of distribution of funds. It's also important that there should be an enhanced dialogue with Iraq's neighbours, that there should be initiatives to support regional cooperation, which is so crucial in this suffering region. Now, there's also the question of the removal of the death penalty. Also, that the government should immediately introduce a moratorium on the death penalty. Also, the question of women. We think, as a political group, that the position of women must be strengthened. Women must be involved at all levels in shaping the country, not only in name but in fact. President, ladies and gentlemen, I think that this agreement is at the same time both a challenge and an invitation for Iraq, and we now are waiting to see how Iraq will actually deal with it. Thank you.
Gracias, Marileni. En nombre...
Thank you. On behalf of the Liberals, for 2 minutes, Jelko KACIN has the floor.
Yes, Miguel, komisarka, ministrica, obiskovalci, kolegice in kolegi. Iraška federacija je...
Mr. President, Minister, colleagues, following the dictatorship, the Iraqi Federation is now focused on the future despite the fragility of democracy. We have seen we have heard today from the Taoiseach that we need to look at the future with new vigour. The current leader of Iraq in Germany today is thinking in terms of abolishing the death penalty. However, Prime Minister al-Maliki has his hands very much tied. What is absurd in a country that exports crude oil and gas is that a large section of the population are without electricity. The EU should do more to rebuild Baghdad. Large swathes of Iraq are still considered by European businesses to be a war zone, yet Erbil in Kurdistan is growing to be the business nexus of the new federation, and this should be better known. Various countries with business ties are opening offices in Erbil, and the EU should do the same.
Gracias, señor Kacin.
Thank you, Mr. KACIN. On behalf of the Greens, for 2.5 minutes, Mrs. Kronberg has the floor.
Thank you, President. The Greens welcome the normalization of relations and possibility of enhanced dialogue with Iraq. Iraq today is a country where the oil productivity is restored to almost full capacity, while the parliamentary democracy still needs strengthening. The Greens welcome the government's commitment to do this, but at the same time we deplore the worsening of the human rights situation. The number of executions is increasing and there is unresolved sectarian violence. Many still live with a deep sense of fear and uncertainty, especially the minorities. We want to stress the importance of adequate laws to protecting women and girls and underline the importance of women's participation in post-conflict reconstruction. The normalization of trade relations is, of course, a positive thing, as is the process of Iraq's accession to the World Trade Organization, a process to which the PCA would be an important stepping stone. The Greens have been critical of the trade chapter of the agreement. It is too much tilted towards EU business interests, leaving too little space for Iraqi government's own decisions. We underline that Iraqi authorities should use their oil revenues as a contribution to sustainable social and economic reconstruction. This should also be the EU's policy towards the Iraq of today. In this respect, the government should introduce a binding corporate social responsibility clause. Honourable members, we think that we cannot open a new chapter with Iraq on solid grounds without at least a minimum acknowledgement of what has happened in the past. It is important at this juncture to bear in mind the recent amendments to the Statute of the International Criminal Court made in 2010, which provide a proper definition for the crime of aggression. As both the EU member states and Iraq are either parties of the ICC or are urged to become parties, it is very important that both sides ratify the new amendments to the ICC statutes as soon as possible. This will strengthen the spirit of the EU-Iraq PCA, as both sides are about to turn a new page in each other's history.
Gracias, señora Kronberg.
Thank you, Mrs. Kronberg. On behalf of the ECR, for 2 minutes, Mr. Struan Stevenson has the floor.
Thank you, President. President, I had prepared a speech this afternoon, but this morning I've received a letter from the Council of Representatives in Iraq, signed by 2 committee chairmen and 5 members of the Iraqi Parliament. Let me read that letter. It was with great dismay and shock that we learned that the European Parliament is about to adopt a resolution on Iraq in the coming week in Strasbourg, which seems completely out of touch with the real situation and everyday challenges on the ground. According to draft text that we have seen on the European Parliament website, the resolution applauds the government on many points, including providing security and safety to the Iraqis. Its main focus seems to be on boosting trade and endorsing the Maliki government, which to us is completely incomprehensible. In a time when our country faces one of its major political crises, with our country's vice president sentenced to death in absentia and the home and office of a minister raided by government forces and his computer and personal belongings confiscated without any justification, while the number of executions has reached record high levels and the masses are outraged in daily protests over arbitrary incarceration and mistreatment of women in Iraqi prisons, with several provincial governments calling on Maliki to go, we would have expected the House of Democracy of the European people to be more attentive to the human rights and democracy which are wearing thinner every day. There is no mention of any of these major concerns in this resolution, and it gives the impression that it's designed to boost the oppressor instead of defending the victims and those who are oppressed. Even if the EU governments might lean towards putting business and trade over human rights, the European Parliament, which represents the people, should blow the whistle and raise the flag of human rights and the universal human values that are equal to all of us, no matter our differences on culture, race or religion. We therefore strongly urge you not to adopt this resolution, which would only be used as a tool of further suppression of our beleaguered people.
Gracias, señor Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. I've seen that Yannakoudakis is asking for the blue card, but I would just like to say that yes, you've asked to ask a question to Mr. Stevenson. However, you've also asked to speak in Catch the Eye. Would you rather ask your question, or would you rather speak under Catch the Eye?
To say is totally different to the question I want to ask, which is based on his...
elija usted porque yo no doy la palabra.
Well, you'll have to choose when you want to speak. If you ask for a blue card, if you want to speak under Catch the Eye, then you can't ask your question now. And if you ask your question now, then you can't speak under Catch the Eye. So you'll have to choose which one you want to take.
I will speak under Catch the Eye, and I will ask my question privately, since it can't be public.
Gracias, gracias por su comprensión.
Well, thank you for your understanding. Now, for 1 minute, Mr. Belder has the floor on behalf of the EFD.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter.
Thank you. Which Iraqi partner does the EU want to draw up a partnership agreement with? It's a crucial question which has to be raised when you see that the Mesopotamic, as it's called, is facing the most major crisis since the end of the civil war in 2006-2007. Crisis elements are cropping up one after the other. For example, in the European Parliament, a crucial decision has been stuck for many years. We've got very different opinions about the federal structure of Iraq and control of the armed forces, apparently unsurmountable differences. Thirdly, tension is growing between the Sunnis and Shiites, and also between the Arabs and the Kurds. We are also seeing an increase in the number of political murders, 4,000 and a few hundred in 2012 alone. Sunni and Shiite resistance is becoming stronger vis-à-vis the Prime Minister Maliki, who monopolizes power. And finally, the civil war in Syria, which is only consolidating the conventional differences in Iraq, whereas the Iraqi government is moving against the Shiites, as is the Syrian government. So I have a very simple question to the European Commission, and that is, how do you intend to draw up an honest partnership agreement with this Mesopotamia, which has been torn to pieces?
Thank you,
Mr. Belder. 2 minutes now for Willy Meyer on behalf of the GUI. Thank you. My group is very critical toward this agreement because we think that we're wasting an opportunity for Europe, for the European Union to distance itself from the war. It was an illegal war, an illegitimate war, and based on lies. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and Al-Qaeda wasn't there. And the real reasons for the war were hidden: oil. There were no other reasons for the war than oil. We have the photo of 3 heads of state with Mr. Bush, the liar who started the war, and also Barroso and Tony Blair. That was the photo that was taken. This was the photo that's been remembered by everyone when they went into this country and undermined it and made it less stable. Thousands of deaths and injuries, and a country which is now worse in social terms than it was before the war. However, oil is going very well. However, it's being traded, but the profits are not being put back into Iraq. And I think we shouldn't waste this opportunity. War can't be used as for business. And this has been done despite the Security Council and the Charter of the UN. It was done for the armaments industry, and it was done just for the interest of those involved in oil. And our group regrets the fact that we're not using this opportunity to send out a clear message. We need to have an agreement, but we have to help the people, not merely multinationals who are involved in oil. Now, Nick Griffin has the floor for 1 minute.
Mr. President, this is a depressing but predictable report. The persecution of hundreds of thousands of Christians, 1.5 million refugees, broken infrastructure, murderous sectarian militias, daily bombings and shootings, child prostitution, honour killings, female genital mutilation and brutal Islamist repression of women. It's good to see the EU, albeit indirectly, admit that Western meddling in Iraq has led to disaster. It would be even better if the cheerleaders for the illegal war of 2003 that created this shambles were to apologise and learn from their terrible error. It is utterly hypocritical for members of the globalist elite to shed crocodile tears over the collapse of Iraq, while at the same time striving to replicate it in Syria. Just as in Iraq, so the fall of Assad would lead not to Syria becoming a replica Switzerland, but to its collapse into bloody anarchy and the triumph of Wahhabi fundamentalism. This meddling has already helped kill hundreds of thousands in Iraq. It's time for a little humility and to leave Syria to the Syrians. Thank you.
Gracias, colega. Hemos terminado el turno.
Thank you. We've finished the round of speakers on behalf of the groups, and now we have a lot of individual speakers. The first for 2 minutes is Mrs. OOMEN-RUIJTEN.
Dank u, voorzitter. Voorzitter, het is nu bijna 10.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's been nearly 10 years since the bombing of the presidential palace in Baghdad by the Americans. 10 years on, the process of democratization that we all wanted is flagging. Iraq faces huge development and reconstruction challenges. There are huge oil reserves, and yet it's one of the poorest countries in the world. Most people in Iraq don't have access to electricity. Mr. President, Iraq absolutely needs to develop into a modern democracy, because only then can it play a key role in the region. Mr. President, for that to happen, there needs to be democracy and rule of law, respect for individual and collective rights in Iraq. And these rights must not just exist on paper, but also in reality. And yet the opposite seems to be the case. There continues to be strife between the Sunni and the Shia government. What about the Christians? What about the situation of women? Many things are going very badly. My colleagues are critical. I am critical. But at the same time, I have to say, what else can we do other than conclude a partnership and cooperation agreement with Iraq? If we have an agreement, we can ensure it is respected, and we can be more severe in terms of enforcing human rights in Iraq. It's a last-ditch attempt, and of course if it doesn't work, then we throw in the towel. So let's ensure that the rules are respected.
Gracias, querida colega.
Thank you. 2.5 minutes now to Ana Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2008, I drafted a report on the EU's role in Iraq, and I see this report, and with the adoption of the partnership and cooperation agreement, as the natural development of that agreement. I wanted to get us out of this confinement of our divisions of the past, and I mean not just the war, the invasion, but actually at the time when EU governments were supporting Saddam. And I seem so often, it's quite frustrating to see that over this time there's been a lot of obstacles, because even here in this parliament, even in the delegation on Iraq, there are people who keep to this prejudices, who keep, for instance, raising the question of Camp Ashraf, and I want the problem of the people in Camp Ashraf to be sorted out, as an obstacle to the development of the relations with Iraq. This is about Iran, it's not about Iraq. And I hope that our colleague Stevenson, who chairs the delegation on Iraq, as a result of what he said, will take consequences if this report is adopted and will step down from the chairmanship of the delegation for Iraq. I believe this agreement is very important to actually enable us to do more for Iraq in what all have said that we need. It's of course, the rule of law. It's democratic governance. It's human rights. It's women's rights. And last time I was in Iraq, I was in a wonderful meeting of more than 300 Iraqi women in Erbil. There's a lot of work to be done. It's a fight about corruption. It's democratic governance. And the Iraqis are open to that. We have been the ones missing, although there have been some good work done by you, just Lex, and our delegation in Iraq. And I'd like to see our delegation in Iraq more autonomous, with their own premises, not having to be bound by the British security rules, able to move around, able to work in Erbil and in Basra as much as in Baghdad. Iraq is enormous, is diverse, and there are different possibilities to work. And definitely, I do not discount the tremendous strategic implication of Iraq for the region, and the implications for the Iraqi situation, security situation, and even political situation of big neighbors such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, but as well as the conflict on Syria. So in order to overcome indeed the problems of understanding of what is going on in Iraq, and it's not from the part of the Iraqis, there hasn't been indeed a clear interest in interacting with us. I hope that the mission that is foreseen for this Parliament to go soon to Iraq will go, and on the basis of this agreement will develop a much more intensive personal relationship with our Iraqi colleagues.
Saben ustedes que no.
Thank you. Well, you know that we don't give the floor for the blue card for colleagues who have already spoken in the course of the debate, but our friend Mr. Stevenson has been mentioned by name, and so I think it's all fair and good that if he takes a very short time, he can ask a question of Mrs. Gomez if she accepts, which she does. So, Mr. Stevenson, you have the floor for your question.
Well, thank you very much, President, for allowing me to respond to that astonishing outburst from Mrs. Gomez. Mrs. Gomez didn't come with the delegation when they went to Iraq last year. I don't see her name on the list to come in 3 weeks' time. You are coming. I'm glad to hear it. After such a glowing speech in favour of Iraq, are you aware that yesterday one of the Iraqi members of parliament for Al-Iraqiyya was assassinated in Fallujah? Are you aware that one of the great sheikhs of the Al-Jabari clans has been assassinated in Nineveh province yesterday as well? Are you aware that hundreds of thousands of people are demonstrating on the streets in unprecedented demonstrations? Can you answer?
Ha pasado el tiempo.
Thank you. You're out of time. Mrs. Gomez, would you like to answer?
Where I've been coming to Iraq often. I was not able to come in that mission last year, but I'm scheduled to go in the next one. I've been coming often to Iraq. Probably one of the members of this Parliament has been more often in Iraq. I know the reality. I'm not discounting the tremendous security implications, the tremendous problems in terms of human rights, of governance, of the rule of law, of interethnic tension, of religious tension, but I believe that it's by interacting with Iraqis that we can better know the situation, not follow the lines that often come here that are too excessive, and to actually improve our relations with Iraq and help the Iraqis move forward.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Well, Mrs. Gomez, Mr. Stevenson, let me wish you a happy trip in this mission that you're going to go on. Both of you apparently are going to be visiting Iraq. So, now Mrs. Thein has the floor for 1.5 minutes. Thank you, President. Well, I was in Iraq last year, the invitation of a major ayatollah from the Shias. And I got a picture of this country. It's been destroyed. You can see that throughout the country. The Iraqi society has been destroyed, and there's huge mistrust. Also, there is major economic potential and hope for the future in the country. And from the bottom of my heart, I hope that the Iraqi people will be in a position to take their fate into their own hands without external influence and live in security in the future at some stage. Now, against that backdrop, I do hope that tomorrow the first partnership and cooperation agreement between the EU and Iraq first will be supported by a major majority. It's got a lot of economic and financial questions for an unstable country where it has crude oil, which is one of the leading productions in the world. But if Iraq must be called upon to correctly protect human rights, particularly the Christian minorities and women, and if they don't, then that will affect the agreement. Ethnic minorities and corruption are just some of the problems which still exist. The inflow of refugees from Syria, as well as creating greater pressure, and also President Talabani's shaky health position. What will happen there if he steps down? He's provided for relative stability thus far. There have been protests against the government in certain areas of the country, and the Prime Minister has called for dialogue with the protesting groups. I see this type of dialogue as the only way out of this additional political crisis, and it's only if we can overcome this that the agreement can be fully implemented and thereby the promised potential of the country fully exploited. I hope the agreement will help to solve these various problems together.
Gracias, señora.
Thank you, Mrs. Thein. Mr. Konrad SZYMASKI for 1.5 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be an extremely important agreement which could pave the way to political dialogue between the European Union and Iraq and promote trade. Iraq has had a very dark recent history with 2 military interventions involving European countries. We therefore ought to open the door to Iraq. We should increase political dialogue and trade. That will contribute to stabilization of the country. Without stabilization of the country, it's hard to imagine stabilization of the region, which is anything but stable. That's why I'm extremely grateful to the rapporteur, who has used very robust words regarding defense of the rights of religious minorities, not least Christians who've been there for 2,000 years. He used robust language on religious freedom because, yes, without respect for religious freedom in the region, there cannot be lasting peace in the region. And that's why that is a matter that should permanently be enshrined on the agendas of our meetings.
Gracias, señor Szymański.
Thank you, Mr. Szymański. Now, 1 minute to my dear friend, Mr. Provera.
Thank you, Chair. We are in favour of the agreement with Iraq because it represents an open channel of communication and a constant channel of communication and between Europe and a country coming out of war which wants to set up a democratic system, democracy which it's never known throughout its history. There are many problems. There are conflicts between different religions, Sunni and Shia, lots of frequent attacks. Representation of minorities in government and institutions is very low, and there is a huge outflow of Iraqi citizens to neighbouring countries and to Europe. And there are also other serious problems that we've heard about: corruption, pressure from Iran in internal Iraqi problems. Our task is to help this country by providing our experience in democracy and state building, and through all the technical means we have, and putting on strong political pressure rather than merely financial support, which Iraq is less in need of. This is the first step on a long journey, and we should never forget our motto: more for more and less for less.
Gracias, Fiorello.
Thank you, Fiorello. Now, 2 minutes for Mr. Lisek.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, Commissioner, Minister. Until recently, 10 years ago, we regarded Iraq as the front line. It was the theatre of war. Some EU countries were involved in those military interventions. Those were emotional times. My country, Poland, was involved militarily. It was in the coalition of the willing under the United States. But there were member states of the EU that didn't share our view. Today, emotions have calmed, but there are still differences of opinion. We're no longer talking about sending troops to Iraq. We're talking about partnership and cooperation between the European Union and the Republic of Iraq. That is extremely important for many reasons, including security reasons, security in the region. In the face of the terrible situation in Syria, we'd like there to be peace and calm in Iraq. We'd like to see a diminution between the Shia and the Sunni population in Iraq. We hope that the Al-Qaeda organization in Iraq can be rooted out entirely. The way ahead is economic and political cooperation. Iraq is at the beginning of the road to building a normal democratic state. And, of course, the European Union, its institutions and the member states should lend Iraq a helping hand towards democracy and modernization.
Gracias, colega.
Thank you. Now, Mrs. Costa for 2.5 minutes.
President.
Thank you, President. I would like to thank the rapporteur and also, of course, the Council and Commission for what they've had to say. I believe that this partnership and cooperation agreement can finally allow us to move into a new important stage of the bilateral relations between the EU and Iraq. Politically, in the political field, on development aid and in the trade field as well. There's been the adoption of a new constitution following the elections in Iraq in 2010. And there's a major deadline on the horizon of 2014. There was intervention in Iraq, and we heard this mentioned beforehand that various different countries had different views on this. We are faced now with the sort of support which Europe has been able to extend for the democratization process. And a delegation has been opened in Baghdad, and other offices are also to be open in the same country. The current stage has seen various major significant results. We have to recognize that on the difficult track of national reconciliation. And let me mention the idea of the national unity government and the human rights body as an independent body. That has to be consolidated. But Mr. Stevenson, I'm sure you're aware that there are still some major issues out there. For example, the capital punishment, which is increasing, and the problems with the Christians. 100,000 of them have been forced into exile. Questions of torture used to extort confessions, and also the ministers of the Interior, National Security, Defence, the Prime Minister, the question of refugees as well. But this agreement has already been said by various colleagues, and I would agree with them, finally allows the EU to lay the foundations for an enforced dialogue, particularly at political level, on questions such as foreign policy, security, peace, national reconciliation, the rule of law and human rights, as well as stability. At the same time, creating permanent bodies, parliamentary bodies as well, for example, the Parliamentary Cooperation Committee, together with the Council and the Cooperation Committee, which will consolidate an ongoing constitutional dialogue, not just a one-off. One important point for us is for the EU, but the UN also, to help solve the humanitarian emergency. You've got 1.5 million refugees in and outside the country. It's a very sensitive issue because in the delegation between Iraq and the EU, which I'm a vice chair, we've seen many people bearing witness also to the question of transfers in Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty as well to other countries. The Special Representative Kobler from the UN has been calling on member states for the past month to facilitate their inclusion and repatriation as well. Just 1 second. No, you've been, you're already more than half a minute over your time, so I'm sorry you're out of time now. Mr. Rubik has raised a blue card. Now, I don't know whether it's because he wants to use, yes, you do, you want to use the blue card. Mrs. Costa, would you like to answer Mr. Rubik's question? In that case, please, Mr. Rubik, go ahead with your question.
Thank you,
Mr. President. Mrs. Costa, my question is this. You talked about support. Do you think it would be possible for the European Union to do something in the field of research and small and medium-sized businesses, innovation? Would that be an area of cooperation?
Rubik.
Mr. Rubik. Could you please start the question again, because Mrs. Costa didn't have her headphones on, so she's not going to be able to answer your question if she didn't hear it in the first place. So if you could repeat it, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I hope Mrs. Costa can hear me now. I was going to ask her a question about cooperation, as that's what she was referring to. I wonder, would science, would education, would small and medium-sized entrepreneurship be an area where we could develop a relationship and cooperation with Iraq?
¿Puede usted contestar a la pregunta?
Mrs. Costa, if you could answer that question, please. Yes, the importance of this framework agreement is that it can guarantee new forms of cooperation, economic cooperation as well, in order to support the health services, the economy and education within a framework of more for more, where we have a safeguard clause as well. So this support, in return, there has to be a respect of human rights, because otherwise there will be repercussions in terms of the economic and financial side. Thank you very much indeed. For 1.5 minutes now, Mrs. NICOLAI.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner. You might think that there's no need to discuss this partnership and cooperation agreement given what the colleagues have said. My view is that the European Union could make itself a relevant actor, could be involved in the political process rather than just criticize from a distance. The partnership and cooperation agreement would give the EU an opportunity to help Iraq seek solutions to its problems. The European Union ought to feel a sense of responsibility, given the way we supported the United States in the war 10 years ago. The PCA is also important from the point of view of security. The kind of Iraq we want is an Iraq devoid of ethnic conflict. We don't need a Syria type situation in Iraq. Now we have an opportunity to get involved politically. This agreement will allow the EU to get involved. Both sides will benefit from the agreement. There is a significant trade component. That's good for the EU. But for Iraq, we will be supporting the consolidation of its democratic institutions. There aren't so many people around who are offering this kind of help, and the Iraqi government should look after its resources carefully, and the EU should support it.
Thank you, Mrs. Nicolai. Mr. Tannock for a minute and a half.
Progress since the fall of Saddam Hussein, but key concerns remain about the stability of the country and the status of human rights within it. Iraq's government is fragile and its people continue to face the daily anxiety of terrorism and intercommunal violence. Only today, 10 people were reportedly killed in an attack on political offices in Kirkuk. The ECR, my group, accepts the need for a PCA. We must engage economically and politically with the Iraqis and help them to realise their aspirations as best we can. Nevertheless, the level of government corruption is a major concern, as is the al-Maliki Shia-dominated administration's support for both Iran and Syria. It has dented its credibility enormously by permitting the flow of Iranian arms to President Assad. We cannot ignore the human rights outlook. Well over 100 inmates were executed last year, with numerous reports of police torture and forced confessions, while women and minorities such as the Christians face acute lack of state protection, and homophobic violence has reportedly been increasing. There are also grave fears over the freedom of expression and the safety of journalists. On a separate note, we are seriously concerned over the threat to send PMOI inmates, now moved to Camp Liberty from Camp Ashraf, back to Iran, with a direct possibility of torture and execution. I do, however, support the prosperity and also stability of the Kurdish Autonomous Democratic Region, which is now exporting oil directly to Turkey. We must hope that this stability can be extended to the whole country eventually. Thank you.
Gracias, Charles.
Thank you, Charles. Mr. Frank van Hekke for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I think it's rather too easy to speak out against violence against Christians in Iraq and the exodus that's leading to. These are just words. We lack political courage to deal with the consequences. The truth is that the Iraqi government is doing absolutely nothing to guarantee safety for Christians, and that's the case in most Muslim countries. If you read the most recent reports from Human Rights Watch, murders of Christians are almost never punished. And despite this, we are able to sign partnership and cooperation agreements with the political leaders of the country. I don't think we do enough when it comes to actually enacting human rights policies in the European Union.
Tiene 2 minutos el colega Eduard KUKAN.
So 2 minutes now to our colleague Eduard KUKAN.
The partnership and cooperation agreement with Iraq as the first contractual relations agreement with this country is an important step in the EU-Iraq relations. Such agreement is needed. The recent situation in Iraq, however, shows that it might bounce on several difficulties. The stability of the country and respect and guarantee of fundamental human rights seems to be among the major ones. Maliki's government have been heavily criticized, especially over the issues related to democracy, respect for human rights and overtaking the institutional control over the country. This has been also echoed by rallies and demonstrations, and moreover some extreme incidents which are taking place over the country and which were mentioned here in this debate is giving a sight of deeper problem. I would also like to mention here a particular point, despite some other views expressed by previous speakers. I think that it's completely legitimate for us, the European Union, to call on the Iraqi government to improve the living conditions for the people who stay in the Camp Liberty by converting it into full-fledged refugee camp with all necessary things which belong to that, and also ask the government to allow the people there to use their property. Having all this in mind, I am concerned about the signing the agreement at this time. I think nevertheless that we should be engaged with Iraq to have instruments in hand in order to develop the relations with the country. At the same time, I am glad that among the main elements of the agreement are clauses on political dialogues, human rights and also clauses on combating terrorism. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Edward. Now, for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Pașcu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will start with the conclusion. The agreement will be approved. This is my opinion. The real question is to what extent the agreement represents an effective instrument permitting the EU to support the reintegration of a democratic Iraq into the international community and its institutions, the WTO included. Iraq, however, is still facing formidable challenges, both internally and externally. Internally, with my Romanian experience in mind, the main challenge to the Iraqi authorities is to provide their citizens with basic services such as decent living conditions, health and education, and above all, security. The Iraqi citizens should be convinced that their life is now better than under Saddam, otherwise all sacrifice would seem to have been in vain and the momentum for change will fade away. The Iraqi authorities still have a long way to reconcile the old traditions with new democracy, respect of law and human rights, above all the right to live, of minorities, and with federalism in state organization. In turn, the external challenges are impressive too. In that respect, there is no secret that in regard to Syria, Iraq does not share EU's perceptions and positions, quietly supporting the Assad regime, sometimes in apparent conjunction with Iran. However, such differences do not annul the value of the present agreement, which will hopefully provide the framework for their discussion. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Pașcu. Now, for 1 minute, Mr. Poreba.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, today we are debating a very serious agreement, a partnership and cooperation agreement with Iraq, the provisions of which, if they're respected rigorously, will speed up the development of the country and will calm the situation in the region. Nonetheless, talking about Iraq today, there are 3 issues we must not overlook, 3 issues which will be crucial for the future of the country and the political situation in the region. There is widespread corruption in Iraq. Iraq, I think, is top of any league table when it comes to corruption, and there the European Union should bring heavy pressure to bear. Secondly, the situation of the Christians. Hundreds of thousands of Christians are persecuted, raped, murdered, forced out of their homes. There, the diplomatic position of the European Union has to be extremely robust. And thirdly, the doubtful activities, dubious activities of the Iraqi government helping the Syrian regime and cooperating with Iran. Those are 3 issues that are going to require the EU to wield considerable diplomatic clout to change Iraq, to help Iraq change for the better.
Gracias, colega. Tiene 1 minuto.
Thank you. Mr. Kurski for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just like the rest of the Arab Peninsula, Iraq is hugely important in geopolitical terms. Supporting the democratization of Iraq and the westernization of Iraq are vital. The partnership and cooperation agreement between the EU and Iraq is to be welcomed. But there's a but. Yes to trade, but no to the trampling of human rights. 250,000 Christians in Iraq had a relatively quieter life under the criminal regime of Saddam Hussein than they have now. We are seeing aggressive Islam raising its ugly head in the form of rapes and murders. The problem isn't confined to Syria or Mali, it's also in Iraq. The Iraqi authorities must guarantee that the constitution is respected, that the law is respected, that human rights of all Christians in Iraq are respected.
Gracias, colega Kurski.
Thank you very much indeed. Now 2 minutes for Tunne KELAM.
Muchas gracias, President. Commissioner, Minister, warm welcome to you for the next 6 months. I think it is a bold initiative by the European Union to engage Iraq as a long-term partner and take co-responsibility for building a stable democracy there. It's good that in Maura's report there's stressed the basic principle: using Iraqi oil resources should be conditional of the implementation of the rule of law and following fully international standards for contracts. The crucial problem, however, is the fragility and unstableness of Iraqi state until now. The 2-year-old Arbil agreement about creating a national unity government has not been, unfortunately, carried into practice. Instead, the Prime Minister has concentrated more and more power in his own hands. The situation of religious and ethnic minorities remains extremely precarious. Especially this is true about Christians, whose numbers have dwindled to less than 1%. We are seeing this historic minority disappearing before our eyes, and we should take co-responsibility for this too. One trend which the report does not fully address is a long-term impact that Iran's military dictatorship and its secret services are exercising on majority Shiite politicians, especially the Prime Minister. The question to be answered before any PCR could be signed is: how can we expect our future partner to be reliable and democratic while retaining such intimate relations with aggressive and terrorism-exporting regime of Tehran, against whom the EU is applying sanctions? And I am very unfortunate about the present wording of the paragraph number 17. I think it needs to be corrected, and the safety and freedom of individual choice of Ashraf residents should be respected fully. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. KELAM. I'd now like to invite Mrs. BOZKURT to take the floor for 1 minute.
In Iraq, tensions among religious and ethnic groups are on the rise. The situation in the country is worsening. At such a critical time, the EU is concluding a partnership and cooperation agreement with Iraq. This year started with the killing of an Assyrian woman. She was not the first to be murdered because of her religion. Assyrians in Iraq do not feel safe. Their churches are under attack. Perpetrators are not being brought to justice. In a country where individual ethnic groups have their own police force, the Assyrians lack any police protection. Same case for the Turkmens of Iraq. And they are also alarmed over a wave of assassinations and abductions targeting their community. They face discrimination in the labour market and suffer from arbitrary detentions. I support the partnership and cooperation agreement, not despite of, but because of these problems. The people of Iraq need a deep, sustainable democracy based on human rights, equality and the rule of law. However, how is the EU going to make sure that these principles are being upheld? Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Piotrowski for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. In the motion for resolution, in paragraph 14 of the motion for resolution, the European Parliament refers to violence in Iraq against religious communities, including Christian minorities. I'm glad that that wording is there, and I would appeal to High Representative Ashton in her to raise the matter with all due seriousness in her discussions with the Iraqis. The EU is built on Christian values, and yet we're dealing with Iraq, a country which, according to the international organization Open Doors, is 4th in the global list of persecution of Christians. Churches are attacked, and the physical integrity of Christian people is attacked. Many people have had to leave the country as a result of persecution. Just a quarter remain. I hope that today's resolution will lead to real measures to protect Christians in Iraq.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. ESSAYAH for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Minister, in the report on the EU-Iraq Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, a number of cooperation opportunities are mentioned, as are many challenges which we have to resolve in Iraq, with Iraq. In particular, we need to promote human rights and good governance. Promoting democratization and stability is more important than just trade. Otherwise, as in other resource-rich countries, it will only be the elite that benefits from selling resources, and the suffering of ordinary people will continue. Large-scale corruption in Iraq will make the process only faster. I'm not convinced about the way Mr. al-Maliki is running the country. The position of women and children is weak. There is persecution of Christians. Thousands are leaving. Human rights are being trampled. Iran and major Arab countries like Syria and Saudi Arabia have major influence in Iraq. The growing influence of Iran is particularly worrying. It's likely to widen the gulf between Sunni and Shia populations. The conditions in Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty are also deeply worrying. Paragraph 17 in the resolution is clearly wrong. The situation in the camps is the reverse of what's said there. A democratic, stable Iraq is a distant dream. We have to think about whether this is the right time for such an agreement, and whether the agreement is the right thing to do at all.
Thank you very much indeed. The next speaker is Mr. Adam Bielan for 1 minute.
Mr. President, Iraq is an important exporter of fuels. It's a major player on the world energy market. Strengthening trade relations, especially in the wake of the last war, is important and in the interests of all of us. The agreement includes provisions on fighting terrorism, illegal trade in arms, and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Respecting human rights will also be a condition of further cooperation. We should be supporting the country because, unlike other countries in the area, we'd like Iraq to be an island of freedom and civil liberties and women's and children's rights. A free, economically strong Iraq could stabilize the Middle East, could improve prosperity and stability in the world. That's a long-term strategy, but it's good news for the future. We should mention religious minorities. There should be no religious conflict, sectarian conflict in Iraq, and Christians deserve special protection.
Thank you, Mr. Bielan. The next speaker is Mr. Czarnecki for 1 minute.
We express our solidarity with the people of Iraq. We support the calls for democracy and for the dictator of Iraq to resign. He is a puppet of the mullahs in Iran and is supporting the real butcher of Syria, Bashar Assad. We are also very concerned about the situation of the Iranian opposition members of PMOI in Iraq. The UN envoy, Martin Kobler, has been an absolute disgrace to the values of the United Nations. General Secretary Ban Ki-moon should replace him because this man is working hand in hand with the Iranian regime against the Iraqi people, including Christians, and also against the Ashraf residents. We call on Baroness Ashton to be active and to put human rights and democracy first, instead of having a good diplomatic relationship and signing business deals with the dictator. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, we're now opening the Catch the Eye procedure, and I'd like to give the floor first and foremost to Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. Now, I agree with all these speeches that have been made by the members here with regard to the situation, and I support most of the points that were made by them.
It's great, actually, that we're not talking about bombing them, etc., as we had in the time of that dreadful dictator Saddam Hussein. And people have pointed out that, asking the question, is it right that we should be having closer cooperation with them now? And I think Mrs. BOZKURT was quite right. Because of their difficulties, now is the time to have closer cooperation and partnership with them, and I welcome the proposals. However, there are two caveats. Number one, my party is the EPP Christian Democrats, and we have to ensure that Christian minorities are protected and recognised in Iraq. I think that's our duty, knowing our history, as Tunne KELAM pointed out. And the second is, we must ensure that the Prime Minister doesn't move to a dictatorship. We have to nudge them towards democracy.
Mrs. Marina YANNAKOUDAKIS.
A few months ago, I met with a group of my London constituents who were refugees from Camp Ashraf. I met them alongside their local MP, Mike Freer, and my colleague, Struan STEVENSON, who is, quite rightly, a hero to those dissidents who have endured the horrors of the camp. The stories I heard from the former residents were extremely shocking. One woman related how her brother had been killed in the camp by Iraqi forces. So far, the international community have failed the refugees, and that includes the European Union. Baroness Ashton's call for an investigation into the Ashraf massacre fell on deaf ears. No investigation ever occurred. Instead, we're here discussing a trade agreement. We can't turn our backs on the refugees of Camp Ashraf and the new camp, which is almost mockingly named Camp Liberty. The challenge of rebuilding Iraq is a great one, but we must never lose sight of the fragile human rights situation in the country.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Yannakoudaki. Mr. PAŠKA is the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner, Minister. Iraq is a country which has been through a terrible war and was decimated by international forces. But some of our states were involved in that. It's therefore the EU's job to help today's Iraq develop economically. I hope, therefore, that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement between the European Union and Iraq will offer new opportunities to the EU to help us do more to democratize Iraq. supporting women's rights in Iraq and supporting the rights of religious communities in Iraq are a major challenge for the EU. Promoting education and developing healthcare are noble objectives, but we have to confess at the present time that it's going to be very difficult. The country is in a mess.
Mr.
Zemke has the floor.
I wanted to thank you for this opportunity to explain how important the partnership and cooperation agreement between the European Union and Iraq is. The idea is for the Union to help Iraq in practice, not just to offer helpful advice. The Union should be able to make a real tangible contribution to the democratization and development of Iraq. It's an urgent matter because in Iraq there is still a real danger of a return to civil war. The agreement contains a list of proposed measures. I would point out, however, that something has been left out of the agreement, and that is education and investing in young people. I would appeal to the European Commission to draft a special program, to devise a special program for well-educated young Iraqis to obtain scholarships. Thank you.
Mr. Mölzer is the next speaker. President, this pending partnership and cooperation agreement between the EU and Iraq, if it really does represent an opportunity, I think it is maybe something we can question about, given the lively debate we're having here. There's a highly explosive situation in Iraq, and the hopes that this agreement can bring about some détente, I think, will be remain a dead letter. I don't think much will change. Now, the Sunnites are asking for general amnesty and the abolition of the anti-terrorist law, and the Shias and others are refusing this. That could really give rise to major explosive regional conflict and could end up with Iraq falling apart. In order to retain peace, I think that the EU, through this agreement, I think really must wait until we have the next elections, because I think that will be a mark of reason. Thank you. Mr. Rossi is the final speaker.
Thank you. I think that before we talk about relations between the EU and Iraq, we have to talk about the Ashraf and Liberty camps. These are political refugees from the Iranian regime, and they've been living for over 20 years in the Ashraf camp. Also, Liberty camp, which was supposed to be a transitional camp, but in fact it's become a prison. That's how the working group on arbitrary detention defined it. The UNHCR refuses to recognize Camp Liberty as a refugee camp. Also, the government of Iraq wants to transfer the Iranian refugees from Ashraf to Camp Liberty. Within the UN, there is pressure to recognize Camp Liberty as a refugee camp. It should be recognized as a refugee camp, or they should go back to Ashraf. Martin Kobler, the representative of the UN in Iraq, should be listened to in this.
Now Mrs. Lucinda Creighton has the floor on behalf of the High Representative. I hope that we have a really fruitful cooperation and that you have a highly productive Irish presidency. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for your kind words. I do appreciate it. And I'd like to thank once again members for a very comprehensive debate, which I think has touched on a wide variety of very, very important issues which are really central to this issue. I think from
what I have heard in the course of this debate, notwithstanding the very genuine and very serious and grave concerns which have been expressed, it is clear that there is, broadly speaking, very, very strong support for the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement between the EU and Iraq. And I welcome that. I think it's extremely important. I think it's extremely important that as we support Iraq on the road to democracy, building stability, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, that we do so from the position of being a relevant actor. And I think one member, I think it was Mrs. Nicolai, made the point that it is essential that the EU become a relevant actor rather than just simply criticising from afar. And I think that's the risk that we run if we don't fully engage in this process and we don't seize this opportunity. I mean, there are many very relevant and important comments which I've registered, which have been made by members, Mrs. SAïFI, Mrs. Koppa, Mr. Klein, raising issues about the need for development, the need to pave the way for Iraqi membership of the ICC, the need to develop a partnership through this process with Iraq, while also recognising the major challenges that exist in terms of religious minorities. Many members have made reference to the very serious question of Christian minorities, prisoners' rights, the rise in executions, which I addressed in my opening remarks in respect of the death penalty and the abuse of the death penalty, which is a major cause for concern. Just to perhaps try to address some specific questions and issues that have been raised. In answer to Mrs. Gomez, we definitely want to give more autonomy and to improve our delegation accommodation in Baghdad. There is no question about that, but we are working on it. But of course, it is necessary to have the appropriate financial resources in order to do that, and that is a challenge which we all face in the EU. To Mr. Stevenson, Mrs. Gomez and many other members, I share your concern about the ongoing events taking place in Iraq. The different communities are certainly there is certainly a large degree of uneasiness, of tension, which is mounting, and major challenges face the administration there and indeed the civilian population. But I think again it is important to stress that these tensions are the very reason why this agreement is so important. It is more crucial that the EU remain close both to the Iraqi nation, the Iraqi government and the Iraqi population in order to make progress and to help to deal with this big challenge of the tensions between the various communities, that we build understanding, we build support, and we do it from a position of influence and leverage. As I mentioned, many of you, indeed I think the majority of speakers expressed deep concern about the Christian community. And here again I think that there is genuinely reason for concern. And it is an issue that has been raised constantly in our ongoing dialogue with Iraqi authorities. It has been raised again and again, and the High Representative and her team are very closely monitoring the situation and very, very vigilant about developments in that respect. The same, I think, can be said about Camp Ashraf, and it's been raised by a number of members, and the transfer to Camp Liberty. This is, of course, an extremely complex and a very significant challenge, not only with regard to the present conditions of all those who have been transferred to
to the new camp, but also with regard to the whole question about the future and how we can actually deal with the challenge of accommodating and finding options for those who are presently in Camp Liberty. And I think that this very clearly requires constructive engagement from EU member states, a willingness to face this challenge and to put in place practical solutions. But it also requires the full cooperation of our international partners, and we are working on that. It's an ongoing process. I know that at times it's slower than we might like, but that is, I think, a reflection of the scale of the challenge that's involved. So we are giving it constant attention, and it is under discussion, as I said, amongst the EU member states and indeed with our international partners. I just want to reiterate the point that I think that this agreement is extremely important. It's a key tool that can be used constructively by the European Union to promote and defend our common interests and our shared values. And that's, I think, a very powerful tool that we cannot underestimate. Just to conclude, I suppose, let me stress that the EU is committed, very committed, deeply committed to underpinning the new partnership with continued assistance. And despite Iraq's significant resources, targeted support, as has been pointed out by a number of members, is clearly still critically needed. The EU will focus on delivering capacity building programmes and technical assistance where they are most needed and where they have the greatest potential impact. For Iraq remains today, more than ever, very clearly an indispensable strategic partner with the European Union at a moment when, as I said earlier, the whole region is facing major challenges and really does need to build a solid and a very serious partnership with Europe and with our allies. And I would like to just conclude by again thanking Mr Salafranca and particularly the rapporteur, Mr Mauro, for the work that has been done on this file. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. The rapporteur has the floor. Mr Salafranca for 2 minutes.
Señor Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, Minister, colleagues. I'd like to make 3 comments on the debate we've just heard. First of all, I've taken note of all the observations and comments and concerns that have been made over the course of the debate. And I will pass them on to the rapporteur before the voting which takes place tomorrow. I would also like to say that I've had the opportunity to note that members of this House continue to focus obsessively on the past. And I think that focusing so much on the past will prevent us from building in the future. The world has changed a great deal over the last 10 years. The transitional period is very fragile. And despite this, despite the violence, despite the human rights situation, the European Union has to make its contribution towards peace, towards understanding and reconciliation and reconstruction in the country. My third and final comment, Chair. I think we have to reflect the comments that have been made about human rights, rights for women, and also the rights of the people who are currently in the Liberty camp. We have looked into this. Minister Creighton has looked into this and has taken account of concerns expressed on this level. And I would just like to say that I've taken account of her proposal to use European Union resources and to put these at the make these available to the United Nations for the rights of the people in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to the rapporteur, our colleague Salafranca. Now, there we have a draft resolution as the result of this debate, and the vote will take place tomorrow at 12 o'clock. The next item on our agenda is a Council and Commission statement on the issue of recent casualties in textile factory fires, notably in Bangladesh. The Minister, Mrs. Lucinda Creighton, now has the floor on behalf of the Council.
Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, President. Honourable members. The recent factory fire in Ashulia near Dhaka was a tragedy, and over 100 people, many of them young women, lost their lives in this horrendous incident. I know that we all share a sense of shock at what happened and extend our profound sympathy to all those who lost family members and loved ones. This incident has served to highlight the wider problem of working conditions in many factories in Bangladesh, and in particular the routine breach, in many cases, of basic safety rules. We cannot let this incident pass without renewing our efforts to support the Bangladeshi authorities in raising standards of occupational safety and health in the industry and indeed throughout the country. All those working in the garment or in any other industry in Bangladesh clearly deserve better. They have a basic right to decent, safe and secure working conditions. The EU has a particular role to play. We are Bangladesh's largest trading partner. This trade has helped to stimulate economic growth and create much-needed jobs. The clothing sector is the mainstay of the Bangladeshi economy. Bangladesh export performance over recent years has been very strong, thanks in part to the duty-free and quota-free market access which the EU offers to imports from Bangladesh in the context of the Everything But Arms arrangement, which is an integral part of the EU's generalised system of tariff preferences. But it has to be of concern to us when goods are produced in factories with unacceptably low safety standards and where employees routinely put themselves at risk simply in carrying out their daily work. That's why the EU has been at the forefront of efforts to secure improvements in safety standards in Bangladesh. We have been supporting a number of projects to help employers' associations and others to ensure compliance with health and safety rules and raise these issues regularly in our discussions with both government and business representatives. This is important work, but the tragic fire in Ashulia shows that more needs to be done. More generally, the EU has a range of instruments available to help us address this issue, not just in Bangladesh, but wherever safety standards at work are a cause for concern. I'd like to focus this afternoon on how we can make effective use of these trade policy instruments, and in particular their link with the promotion of International Labour Organisation guidelines and recommendations. The generalised system of preferences is one of the most important instruments available to us to connect social and human rights issues to trade policy. In addition to the general GSP system, special arrangements for sustainable development and good governance, known as GSP+, provide for additional trade preferences for countries which ratify and effectively implement 27 specific international conventions, including those on core international human rights and labour rights. All GSP arrangements can be also temporarily withdrawn from those countries where there is evidence of serious and systematic violations of the principles contained in those conventions. This isn't just a hollow threat. It has happened in several cases, such as Myanmar and Belarus, where the general GSP arrangement has been withdrawn, and in Sri Lanka, where the GSP Plus was withdrawn. We are committed to improving environmental and social standards globally. For the time being, the main mechanisms for pursuing these political objectives are bilateral, given the limited prospects for the establishment of multilateral rules on relations between trade, labour or the environment within the WTO framework. That has led to our insistence of the inclusion in bilateral trade agreements of provisions on sustainable development. It does not mean that we are not active more widely. We continue to do what we can to take forward this agenda within the international organisations such as the WTO and the International Labour Organization. I know that Parliament is also concerned about the increasing risks of environmental and social dumping and the consequent distortions of competition on the EU market. We share these concerns and will continue to make full use of all the options available in our own legislation and through the sustainable development clauses in bilateral free trade agreements in order to counter these risks. A further important aspect is that of investment. European businesses which invest in Bangladesh play a vital role in helping to stimulate economic growth and create jobs.